In the winter of the year 48 before our era, the harbor of Alexandria was on fire. Julius Caesar was trapped in the palace quarter of the greatest city in the world, cut off, outnumbered, an Egyptian fleet closing from the sea. So he did what a cornered general does. He ordered his men to burn the ships in the harbor. The fire caught and spread and ran up the waterfront. And somewhere in that night, the ancient writers tell us, the flames reached the shelves of the Library of Alexandria, and 40,000 scrolls went up as smoke over the Mediterranean. This is the scene we have all inherited. The Library of Alexandria dying in a single night. The gathered knowledge of the ancient world, every play, every map, every measurement of the heavens, turned to ash in one catastrophe and lost forever. It is one of the great wounds in the human story. The night we burned our own memory, except that it did not happen that way. Caesar's fire was real, but it did not kill the library. Scholars were still working in Alexandria for centuries afterward. The 40,000 scrolls that burned were most likely warehouse stock, stacked by the docks for export, not the collection itself. The library survived that night. It did not die in a fire at all. It died slowly, over 300 years, so quietly that no one can name the day. And it died not because of what men did to it, but because of what it was made of. Because every word in that library was written on the same fragile thing, a reed, pulled from the mud of the Nile, and that reed was doomed from the moment it was cut. This is the history of the Library of Alexandria, told not through the fire, but through the papyrus, the doomed material that carried all that knowledge and in the end doomed it. Start with the plant, because everything grows out of the plant. Its name is Cypress papyrus. It is not a tree, and it is not grass. It is a sedge, a tall marsh reed that once grew in vast green thickets along the still edges of the Nile, especially in the wetlands of the delta, where the great river spread out and slowed before the sea. It could stand 4 or 5 meters high. Its stem was not round, but sharply triangular, thick as a wrist at the base, crowned with a burst of fine threads like a green firework. To the Egyptians, this plant was everything. They twisted its fibers into rope and sandals and baskets. They bound it into boats that floated across the marshes. The papyrus reed was the very symbol of Lower Egypt, carved onto temple columns, held in the stone hands of gods. But its greatest use was the one that changed the world, because from the soft white core of that reed, the Egyptians learned to make a surface you could write on, smooth, pale, light, and foldable into a roll, the first true page. For 3,000 years and more, this single plant was how human beings recorded almost everything. It carried the accounts of empires, the letters of lovers, the contracts of merchants, and the thoughts of the greatest minds who ever lived. When a Greek or a Roman held a book in his hands, he was holding this Egyptian reed, and you are still holding it now in a way every time you say the word. Our word paper comes straight from papyrus. The word Bible comes from biblos, the Greek name for the papyrus reed, borrowed from the port that traded it. The very words we use for reading are fossils of a plant pulled out of an Egyptian swamp. So, how do you turn a marsh weed into a page? We know because a Roman named Pliny the Elder wrote it down 2,000 years ago, and because people have since made papyrus with their own hands and proved him roughly right. You cut the green reed and strip away the hard outer rind until you're left with the soft white pith at the center. That pith you slice lengthwise into long, thin ribbons, as even as you can make them. Then you lay them out side by side on a board, edges just overlapping, until you have a square sheet. And across that first layer, at a right angle, you lay a second, strips running the other way, so that the whole thing becomes a lattice, a woven grid of pale reed. Then you press it. Under weight or a wooden press, the two layers are crushed together, and here the plant does something quietly miraculous. It glues itself. The reed's own sap, its natural sugars, seep out under the pressure and bind the strips into a single sheet with no other adhesive at all. The page makes itself out of its own body. You dry it in the sun and polish it smooth with a shell or a rounded stone until it will take ink without bleeding. And you have a sheet of papyrus. One sheet is not a book. So you glue the sheets edge to edge into a long strip and roll it up. A standard roll ran perhaps 5 meters. Some ran far longer. Pliny even graded the stuff. The finest, whitest papyrus reserved for sacred and literary texts, down to the coarse brown grade fit only for wrapping fish in the market. It was a beautiful technology, light, portable, cheap enough to use by the mile. And it had one fatal flaw hidden inside its own fibers that no craftsman could ever fix. Now carry that roll to Alexandria. Alexander the Great founded the city on the Egyptian coast in 331 before our era, then died young, and his empire was carved up among his generals. Egypt fell to one of them, a shrewd Macedonian named Ptolemy, who made himself pharaoh and founded a dynasty. And the Ptolemies wanted something no ruler had ever possessed, not just an empire, not just an army. They wanted all of it, all the knowledge in the world gathered under one roof. They built the Mouseion, the shrine of the Muses, with the great library at its heart. And they gave it an ambition so vast it still sounds like madness. They set out to own a copy of every book that existed, every book in every language on earth. To fill the shelves, they became magnificent thieves. Their agents crossed the Mediterranean with money to buy up whole private libraries, and they passed a law that every ship docking at Alexandria had to surrender the books aboard it to be copied. The scribes copied the text. The library kept the original and handed back the copy. These confiscated books were cataloged simply as books from the ships. The finest stories, the greatest theft of all. The city of Athens kept the official master copies of its 3 great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, the definitive texts, treasured and guarded by the state. Ptolemy III asked to borrow them, only to copy them, he promised, and put down a colossal deposit. 15 talents of silver, a fortune. Then he simply kept the originals. He sent Athens the copies and cheerfully forfeited the silver. The texts were worth more to him than any amount of money, and both sides knew it. Book by stolen book, the library grew, until the shelves held, the ancient writers claim, 400,000 rolls. Some said 700,000, a single building trying to hold the entire mind of the human race. And for a few golden generations it worked. The Library of Alexandria became the most concentrated gathering of genius the ancient world ever produced. Under its roof, a librarian named Zenodotus took the tangled texts of Homer, copied and miscopied for centuries, and edited them into order, giving us something close to the Iliad we still read. A scholar named Aristophanes of Byzantium invented little marks to guide the reader through unbroken ancient writing, the distant ancestors of our accents and our punctuation. The very commas on this page were born in that library. The chief librarian, Eratosthenes, did something that should have been impossible. Using only shadows, the angle of the noon sun in two distant cities, and geometry, he measured the size of the whole planet and got it very nearly right, 2,000 years before anyone left the ground. Here, Euclid laid down the geometry still taught in schools today. Here, a thinker named Aristarchus dared to suggest that the earth moves around the sun. Here, physicians became the first Greeks to open the human body and map what lay inside it. And presiding over the shelves was a poet named Callimachus, who faced a problem no one had ever faced before. How do you find one book among hundreds of thousands? So he built a catalog, the pinnaces, the tables, 120 rolls listing the authors and their works, sorted and described. It was the first library catalog in history, the first time anyone had tried to draw a map of everything known. But notice what all this genius really was underneath. It was copying. The library was, before anything else, an enormous engine for copying papyrus. Scribe after scribe, year after year, transferring ink from old rolls onto new ones. Because the men who ran it understood something we have almost entirely forgotten. Their whole civilization of the mind was balanced on a material that was already quietly beginning to die. Here is the flaw, hidden in the reed from the very start. Papyrus is a plant, and plants rot. The same sap that glued the sheet together is also food for mold, for bacteria, for the small insects that chewed their way through ancient libraries. And papyrus drinks water in the damp, breathing air of a Mediterranean port. And Alexandria sat right on the sea. A roll of papyrus takes in moisture, swells, grows spotted with mildew, softens, and comes apart in the hand. In those conditions, a scroll might last a century or two before it was too far gone to read, perhaps 3, if cared for. Then there is the handling. To read a scroll, you unrolled it with one hand and wound it with the other, and every reading flexed the brittle fibers a little more. A well-loved book was a book being slowly destroyed by love. And of course it burned. Papyrus is dried plant tissue. It catches like tinder and is gone in seconds. One overturned lamp and a shelf of irreplaceable thought becomes a handful of gray ash and nothing more. So a book on papyrus was not really an object that lasted. It was a flame, passed hand to hand from one roll to the next, forever. A text survived only as long as somebody kept copying it onto fresh papyrus before the old copy crumbled. Stop copying for one generation or two, no more, and the words were simply gone, not hidden, not sleeping in a vault to be rediscovered. Gone, the way a spoken sentence is gone, rotted back into the marsh it came from. This is the terrible secret of the ancient book. It was immortal only while it was being reborn. And the Library of Alexandria, for all its 400,000 rolls, was not a fortress of knowledge. It was a bonfire that needed constant feeding. The moment the copying slowed, the rot would begin to win, which is why the story of the Great Fire has always been too simple. Go back to Caesar in the burning harbor in 48 before our era. Something did burn that night. The sources agree on that much, and one of them, quoting the historian Livy, gives the figure of 40,000 scrolls. For centuries, that number has been read as the death of the library. But look closer, and the fire shrinks. The rolls that burned were down by the docks, and the likeliest explanation is that they were export stock. Papyrus warehoused for shipping, not the shelves of the Museion up in the palace quarter, and the proof is in what came after. A few decades later, the geographer Strabo lived and worked in Alexandria and wrote about the Museion as a living, working place. Scholars kept being appointed. If Caesar had truly burned the library to the ground, someone in those centuries would have said so plainly. No one did. So the single most famous fact about the Library of Alexandria, that Julius Caesar destroyed it, is not really true. He may have singed it. He did not end it. And this matters more than a footnote, because the fire is a comfort. It lets us imagine the knowledge taken from us in one violent, memorable instant by a villain we can name, a crime with a criminal. The truth is worse and quieter and much harder to look at. There was no single night, no villain. The library was not murdered. It was allowed to decay over centuries by a world that gradually stopped paying the enormous, unglamorous cost of keeping papyrus alive, the endless copying, the endless replacing, the war against rot that can never be won, only postponed. The fire is a story we tell so that we do not have to tell the real one. So, how does a library actually die? Slowly, in pieces, and mostly through neglect. The Ptolemies who built it also in time undermined it. In the year 145 before our era, a king remembered as Ptolemy VIII turned on the scholars of Alexandria, expelling the very intellectuals who had made the city the mind of the world. They scattered across the Mediterranean. The library never fully recovered its brilliance. The gatherers of knowledge had been driven out of the house of knowledge. Then came the long Roman centuries and slow decline. The Museion still existed, but its royal funding dwindled, its prestige faded, its purpose blurred. And every year without funding was a year of copying not done, of rolls quietly crumbling on the shelves faster than tired hands could replace them. The physical blows, when they finally came, fell on something already dying. Around the year 270 of our era, the Emperor Aurelian fought a war to retake Alexandria, and the fighting gutted the Brucheion, the very palace quarter where the great library had stood. Whatever was left of the original collection most likely perished there in a war almost no one remembers. A century later, in 391, a Christian mob under the bishop Theophilus tore down the Serapeum, a temple that had housed a second, smaller library, though by then it is not even clear how many books were still inside to lose. There is one last famous story, that when Arab armies took the city in 642, a caliph ordered the books burned to heat the public baths, and that they fed the furnaces for 6 months. It is a vivid tale. It is also almost certainly an invention written down for the first time 600 years after it supposedly happened. By 642, there was no great library left to burn. It had been gone in truth for a very long time. There was never one death, only a long distracted forgetting. While the papyrus library was fading, its own weakness had already called up a rival, a better material born out of pure spite. Far to the north, in the city of Pergamon, another king was building a library to challenge Alexandria's. The Ptolemies, the story goes, grew jealous and cut off the supply. They banned the export of Egyptian papyrus to starve their rival of pages. And Pergamon, forced to find another surface to write on, turned to animal skin, scraped, stretched, dried, and rubbed smooth into a fine pale sheet. We still carry the city's name for it. Parchment, pergamena, the skin of Pergamon. Parchment was everything papyrus was not. It did not rot in damp air. It did not crack when you folded it. It could be scraped clean and written on again. It was far more costly and far more trouble to make. But it lasted for 1,000 years where papyrus lasted for one, and it could be folded. You could stack the folded sheets and stitch them along one edge into a shape we still use today, the codex. The book with pages and a spine that opens to any point without unrolling a thing. Over the first centuries of our era, the durable codex slowly killed the fragile scroll, and this created a filter, a narrow gate that every ancient text now had to pass through to reach us. Somewhere in those centuries, each work had to be copied off its dying papyrus and onto lasting parchment, into the new book form, or it would not survive the coming darkness. What was copied over lived. What was not was left to rot on the roll. The whole inheritance of the ancient world came down to a single brutal question, asked text by text in the quiet of monastery workshops. Is this one worth the skin? Everything we still have is simply what somebody once decided to save, and most of it they did not save. We tend to picture the lost knowledge of antiquity as a mystery, some vanished secret waiting to be found again. The reality is simpler and far sadder. We know a great deal of exactly what we lost, because we still have the catalogs, the quotations, the lists of titles. We are like a man holding the index of a library that no longer exists, reading the names of books he will never be able to open. Take the tragedians whose master copies Ptolemy stole. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. 7 survive. 7. Of the roughly 90 plays of Aeschylus, the father of tragedy, we have 7 as well. The rest, the overwhelming majority of the greatest drama ever written, are gone, surviving only as bare titles and stray lines quoted by other authors, like the light of stars that burned out long ago. And that is just 3 famous men. Behind them stand whole libraries of vanished work, histories of the world by authors we now know only by name, poems, plays, treatises, encyclopedias, the observations of astronomers, the case notes of physicians, the greater part of everything the ancient mind ever produced. Scholars estimate that of all classical Greek literature, only a small fraction survived the journey down to us, perhaps 1 work in 10. By some counts, far fewer. It was not burned by a villain. Most of it simply reached a century in which no one copied it in time, and the last brittle rolls fell quietly apart in the dark, and that was that. An idea that had lived for 1,000 years ended not with a fire, but with a silence. The silence of a scroll no one opened, rotting on a shelf until it was dust. The Library of Alexandria is not the story of one lost building. It is the story of almost everything lost the same quiet way. And yet, the reed left us a strange backhanded gift, because there was one place on earth where papyrus could not rot. The desert. The one thing that destroyed papyrus was water. And in the bone-dry sands of Egypt, far from the humid coast, there is none at all. And so, buried in the sand, a scroll can lie for 2,000 years and barely change. In the 1890s, 2 young Oxford scholars began digging at an ancient rubbish dump, the old town garbage heaps of a place called Oxyrhynchus, where the people of the Nile had thrown away their worn-out paperwork for centuries. and out of the trash came a flood of papyrus, hundreds of thousands of fragments, tax receipts and shopping lists, private letters and lost gospels, and scraps of vanished plays by the very poets we thought we had lost forever. Sit with that irony. The greatest library ever built on the coast kept nothing because the sea air ate it alive. A provincial town's garbage pit in the desert preserved a library by accident because it was dry and no one cared enough to disturb it. What survived of the ancient world came down to us not from where it was treasured, but from where it was thrown away. There is a stranger gift still. When Vesuvius buried the Roman town of Herculaneum in the year 79, it charred a whole library of scrolls into lumps of carbon, burned but sealed, entombed. For centuries they were unreadable, crumbling at a touch, and now scientists are unrolling them without opening them at all, scanning the blackened rolls with particle accelerators and reading the ink with artificial intelligence, coaxing out the first sentences of philosophy that no eye has seen in 2,000 years. The reed keeps its cruel logic to the very end. The papyrus that survived was the papyrus that burned or was buried in the rubbish. The papyrus that was loved and read and treasured, that is the papyrus that turned to nothing at all. So go back one last time to Caesar's harbor, and the flames on the water, and the story we all believed, that the library of Alexandria died in a single great and terrible fire. It is a story we prefer, because a fire is nobody's fault, a disaster, an accident, a villain with a torch. But the truth is that the library never needed a fire. It was dying from the day it was built, the way a cut flower is already dying in the vase, because it was made of something that could not last. Every roll on those shelves was a marsh reed, sliced and pressed and inked, a plant, and the plants returned to the earth. The knowledge stayed alive only as long as human hands kept copying it forward, faster than the rot could take it. And 1 century, in 100 quiet ways, the hands slowed, the funding dried up, the scholars were driven out, and the reed did what a reed does. It went back to the mud. That is the real death of the Library of Alexandria. Not a night of fire, 10,000 ordinary mornings on which a scroll that should have been recopied simply was not, and softened, and fell to pieces, and carried one more fragment of the human mind down with it into silence. We like to believe that knowledge is permanent, that once a thing is known, it is known forever. The papyrus tells us otherwise. Knowledge is not a monument. It is a fire that has to be carried, written on a material that is always patiently trying to die. It survives only because in each generation somebody chooses to copy it forward one more time. The scholars are dust. The scrolls are dust. The reed still grows on the Nile, green and indifferent, as though none of it had ever happened. We did not lose the Library of Alexandria in a fire. We lost it the moment we stopped copying. And the reed, patient and mortal, simply took its knowledge back.